As you can tell, our building is a little bit different. The sermon will be a little bit different this morning too, because there'll be no PowerPoints or monitors, but also our topic is going to be a little bit different. I'd like to ask you a question. Who gets to decide what is modest and what is immodest? Who gets to choose whether or not a 6-inch seam in a short is too short, or is it a 3-inch seam? Who makes the final decision on those things? Who determines what is modest, what is immodest? Is it just culture, or is it deeper than that? It's interesting if you look in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis 3, you have the fall of man. And in Genesis 3, one of the very first things that takes place after man's eyes are opened, he notices that he's naked. And it says in our biblical text in Genesis chapter 3 that Adam and his wife Eve took fig leaves and made for themselves clothing. Now the Hebrew word there denotes kind of like an underwear around the midsection. And so they still felt like they weren't clothed enough. In fact, God comes to the garden in the cool of the day as he was accustomed to, and Adam and Eve hide themselves. And then God says, "Where are you, Adam?" And eventually he sees where they are, and he says, "Why did you hide from me?" Adam says, "I was naked and I was afraid." So even Adam could tell when his eyes were open that man has this desire, get it built into him, it's processed by God to know what is right and what is wrong and to be clothed. Now, those of the naturalist camp or the nudist camp would say that it's man's basic primitive urge to be free from clothing. And yet, Genesis 3 says the opposite is actually the case. That man, when his eyes were open, realized that he was naked before God. And the very first thing that takes place after the fall of man that we're told about in the Bible, which I think is interesting that God inspired Moses to give us this revelation, the very first thing that man struggles with in the presence of God is his modesty. And I think that thousands of years later, we're still having that battle today, struggling with what is the appropriate way that you and I are to dress before God. What is the appropriate way for us to be modest? And I think it's interesting that all these things have taken place since time and we're still struggling with this question. But one of the things that I think that Genesis 3 can teach us is that modesty is not purely tied to culture. Now, I do think that culture does have an influence on modesty, and some cultures even today, especially Muslim countries in the Middle East, a woman showing her ankles is immodest, and in some places is punishable by death. Now, I don't think that a woman showing her ankles is immodest, but that's not my culture. But I do not think that culture is the authoritative dictator of what is modest and what is immodest. Just like we would look at that and say, well, that's crazy. We still can't say, well, everybody does this, it must be okay, because in our culture, it's accepted. Because in Genesis 3, there is no culture. There is no establishment of a norm for Adam and Eve to fit into. In fact, they've been unclothed completely. Their eyes have not been open, and yet the first thing they realize when they have a knowledge of good and evil is that I should put some clothes on. And so it's not completely tied to culture because there was no overarching culture for them to conform to, just the realization of what is right and what is wrong. And if modesty is not entirely dependent upon culture, we have to ask ourselves, how can I make sure that before God I am modest? Because the Hebrew word that it says there in Genesis 3, Adam took fig leaves and made for himself underwear. The Hebrew word that is used later, God actually kills some animals, takes their skins, and he covers them with a typical Hebrew garment that covers them from the shoulders to the knees. And so there's an obvious difference in the way that Adam clothed himself and the way that God saw fit to clothe Adam and Eve in the garden. You see, we live in a world today that has been revolutionized by the sexual revolution that started taking place in the 1960s. And if you were born deep in that revolution, like myself in the 80s or the 90s, everything that you've ever known in your entire life has been in the midst of this sexual revolution that's still taking place today. But if you were born in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s, you lived in a time that was much different. In fact, nod your head if this is true and shake your head if this is not. You see women wearing things today, or men, every day at Walmart, at work, that if you just saw that in the 1950s, people would have been just aghast. Yes, I wasn't there, so I don't know. So you got to tell me, guys. Yes, no? Some of you are shaking your heads. I had no idea you were around in the 50s. All right. You're aging well. No, I'm just playing. Yeah, it's different, right? My grandmother, right, in 1950, 1960, I mean, if a woman wore blue jeans, I mean, that was just immodest. You know what she wears now? Blue jeans. And she'd been one of the ones gawking in the 1950s. So what changed? What happened? Well, culture changed. We were told by culture it was okay. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying to think that culture is not playing an influence on what we deem to be modest and immodest is to bury the head in the sand. I mean, it does have an influence. So the question is, where are we supposed to derive that from? We're more than just our bodies, and yet we live in a culture where our bodies are extremely sexualized. And a research study that I was showing that was released by a government agency that view these things, it said the average age that a young girl starts to sexualize herself by her clothing or by things that she does in the United States is 6 years old. 6 years old. It's crazy. 85% of all music videos of any genre have women that are overly sexualized, unnecessarily so, in the music videos. It's everywhere in our culture. And to think that we don't have a problem in our culture with over-sexualization and immodesty is to be in denial. I mean, it is a problem that we're facing in our culture, and I'm afraid it's also a problem that we're facing in the church because there's a real danger in immodesty. And I understand the urge that you may have had this morning when you looked at the bulletin and said, oh, we've got a sermon on modesty today. Okay, put on more clothes. All right, let's save that 30 minutes of my day. But it's deeper than that. Immodesty has a psychological and a philosophical impact on our lives. Multiple research studies have been given by both government agencies, by universities, but also by private groups, and they all lead to the exact same conclusion. I spent hours this week reading research studies that have been taking place over the connection between clothing and psychological issues. And one of the things that it talked about in these surveys and these research studies, it said that we have a problem in our culture with self-objectification. And what self-objectification is, what that means is that we are so obsessed about what other people think about us. And that oftentimes, whenever we do something, we are more concerned about how other people perceive it than we are about actually doing it, the task before ourselves at hand. Now, this is an easy one that most of us have done at some point or another. How many of you have sat in a class or a Sunday school where the preacher or the teacher has asked a question and you knew the answer, but you didn't want to raise your hand or you didn't want to say it because you were worried about what other people might think when you answer the question? You ever done that? I think all of us have done that. Well, it goes much deeper than that, and the connection shows that the connection between more immodesty, the more flesh that we show, the more we're concerned. If we show a lot of our legs, we're concerned about what are people going to think when they see this? Are my legs fit? Are they toned? Are they going to be impressed when they see it? And so we're so concerned about what other people think about our bodies even more than doing ourselves. And it says that there's an epidemic, especially with young ladies, but also with young men, when it comes with immodesty dressing, because it says that we have a problem because kids and adults too can't function in schools because they're so focused on what it's like to other people are looking at them or what other people are thinking about them doing the actions than the actions themselves. Maybe you've experienced it in a different way. Maybe there were some individuals who were playing a game. Maybe it was a sport and you thought, well, maybe I'm not too good. And maybe you wanted to play like fun, but you were too afraid to play because you were more concerned about what other people might think of you while you were playing than you were about having fun and just living in the moment. You see, many of us have had to struggle with that, and the connection shows that the more likely we are to dress immodestly, the more we are to be concerned about what other people's perception of us is, the less able that we are to actually function. It shows in the research that people have a worse time when dressing immodestly because of the self-consciousness. They perform lower on logical reasoning tests. They perform lower in athletic performance. They have a lower sexual assertiveness, which means they can't say no when it's time to say no in those situations. And it says it leads to eating orders, cosmetic surgery procedures, low participation in leadership, and also low pursuits in math, sciences, and whenever they are fixated on their bodies and too worried about delving into those harder subjects in class. And so what this tells us is that what we wear has a direct connotation to the psychological outlook that we have on life because we are so constantly concerned about what other people think when they look at us. And so fixing the issue of immodesty is much deeper than just saying put on more clothes. That's too easy, because immodesty is not a clothing issue. Immodesty is a heart issue. It is an emotional issue that goes much deeper than just putting on clothes. When you teach young people that they're more than just a body, that they're more than just being capable of being looked at, and they're going to dress differently than someone who thinks their entire persona is wrapped up in what other people think about them and what they look like. You're going to have individuals who have a better sense of self-awareness and self-control and a better sense of confidence in themselves when they're not so worried about what other people think. Because we live in a day and age where we are conformists. We conform to the world. That's exactly what Romans 12:1 tells us not to do. And yet we live in a day and age where we are constantly trying to conform because we are so concerned about what other people think about us, and that has taken place in our clothing as well. Someone who sees himself as a capable and powerful person with a body that can help achieve those goals are going to act differently and dress differently than someone who thinks that they're just solely existing to be hot. And so they're going to treat their bodies in a different way and not have a self-objectifying mindset. If we can teach our young people and our adults that their beauty and their attractiveness comes from their words and their actions and their confidence and their skills and their service and the goodness that they can provide as an individual, and their attractiveness does not come from what they look like in clothing, they're going to think differently about themselves, about the world around them, and their place in the world. And so the reason why we have a problem with immodesty is not just because we need to have people put on more clothes. We need people to think differently about themselves and their role in this world. Because living just so people can look at you and say, oh, they look cute in that, is a very primitive and honestly a very poor way to live one's life. When you think about you have a life and you have a goal and you're made in God's image and you've been given talents and things that you can do, you're more worried about those things than you are about being fashionable and about showing off your body parts so people will look at you and think that you're cute. There's a real danger also spiritually to being immodest. You see, the Bible, especially in the book of Leviticus, talks about the shame of being naked, talks about it being lewd and lasciviousness and licentiousness, terms which are expressly condemned in both the Old and New Testaments. And not in a mindset with the chasteness and purity that we're supposed to have in the Bible, but we also have a parental responsibility. Now, modesty lies with the individual themselves. We are, the Bible tells us that we will all stand before God and give an account for our own actions. But with just like any other spiritual or moral aspect, parents have a vital role to play when it comes to modesty. And honestly, when you look out and you see young people or even older individuals who are dressed, we need more parents to use this phrase. Absolutely not. When they bring you clothing in the retail store, we've got to have parents who have a backbone and will look at their children and say, over my dead body, right? Absolutely not. We need more parents who stand at the front door and say, where do you think you're going dressed like that? Absolutely not, right? We need more parents to stand up and say, look, you're not going to dress that way. You know, when you leave my house, you got to make your own decisions. But, you know, when I'm buying the clothes and you're living under my roof, you ain't wearing that. Yeah, we need more parents to stand up and say that. I say to my dog all the time, right? You're not going out naked. Put on a collar, you know. And so, you know, I'm not going to tell you to do something I would do myself, okay? So we need more parents to stand up and say, you're not going to dress that way. And maybe you don't see the value in yourself as a person. Maybe you don't understand that your real beauty comes from inside you. But I'm here to help you navigate those waters, and you're going to put on some clothes, right? But also there's an importance of an attitude. If we're seeking to be modest, we're most likely trying to live a godly Christian life. If we're trying to be modest. Now, if we're trying to push the boundaries as much as we possibly can, then we probably have a rebellious spirit that's going to bring negativity in our spiritual life and other aspects of our life, including our modesty. If we've got the idea of, well, you know, a 2-inch inseam is immodest, so I'm going to wear a 3-inch. You know, if that's the mindset that we have, you're already immodest. Because immodesty is a heart issue. It's an attitude issue. If you're more concerned about what other people think about what you are wearing than you are about pleasing God in your clothing, you are immodest. And you may have on a dress today from your neck to your ankles. Doesn't matter. If you're more concerned about looking cute or pleasing the eyes of man than the eyes of God, then you're dressed immodestly. And you may be wearing a suit and tie this morning. Because it's a heart issue. It's an attitude issue. that also makes its way into our clothing. Modesty is not just a dress code. It is, are you valuing who you are, whose image you are made in, and whose life you have pledged service to? It's a contradiction to the way the world thinks. It's a contradiction to modern clothing, but it was also a contradiction to the first century world, and yet the Bible tells us expressly over and over again not to be concerned about adorning our outside bodies, but those on the inside. 1 Corinthians 14:40, but all things should be done decently and order. Of course, that includes our clothing and the way that we dress. Colossians 3:17, and whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. Our clothing is a display of our commitment to Christ and the commitment that we have to the purity and the holiness that He calls us to. And we also have to ask ourselves, and this is the main question when it comes to modesty, whose approval am I seeking? Am I seeking man's, or am I seeking God's? And that's what men and women, young men, so we've got to ask ourselves, am I living a life of godliness where I'm asking myself, is this pleasing to God? Or am I living a life of selfishness where I ask myself, how is this going to make me look in the eyes of other people? Because that's the real key issue to living the Christian life in whatever we want to talk about. In our words, in our actions, the way we carry ourselves, the places that we go, the people that we hang out with. Who am I trying to please, God or man? And our clothing, our modesty, is just another representation of that question inside of you that you've got to ask yourself continually throughout your life. Who am I trying to please in this life, God or man? Ephesians 6:6 says, not by the way of eye service or people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Now the context is here is working, but I think it can be applied just as well to our clothing. Who are we trying to please? The eyes of man or the eyes of God? John 12:43 says, for they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. When we clothe ourselves, whose glory are we seeking? Man's? Or are we seeking God's? And you see, we've got to be sure that we are trying to glorify God. Brittany and I were sitting on the couch just the other day, and a show popped up from the 90s, and Brittany said, why on earth do they think that that was cute? And maybe you've got pictures from the 90s or the 70s or the 80s. You thought, man, what was I doing? You know, who thought that was a good idea? She said, and I tell you, the same people that tell you look cute today. You see celebrities wear that stuff. It's in magazines. It's on TV shows. You go into the department store, it's on the front rack, and people say, this is what is in style. And we try to be in style. So what do? So we wear it. And we look back 20 years and say, well, who thought that was a good idea? The same people that are telling you to wear what you're wearing today, right? Think about that for a second. So in 20 years, you might look back and think, what on earth was I thinking? It's the same people telling you that it's in style, that it's hip, and you were just trying to conform. I'm the exact same way. But like any sin, immodesty is something that we should stay as far away from as possible. And sadly, many do the exact opposite in our culture today. We've got to focus on what true beauty is. In this life, who are we trying to get attention from? God or the opposite sex? In this life, who are we trying to please? The eyes of other men and women or the eyes of God? Proverbs 31:30, when talking about the virtuous woman, the godly woman, it says, charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but the woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3-4 says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, the clothing that you wear, but let the adorning of the hidden person of the heart with imperishable beauty, with a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight or God's eyes is very precious. Proverbs 11:22, like a gold ring in the snout of a pig is a beautiful woman without discretion. You see, the eyes of God are more concerned about the inner woman, the inner man, than what's on the outside. And so we need our young ladies and our young men to realize that they need to be pleasing God and not other people. They need to be seeking the attention of God and not the attention of the opposite sex, and clothing themselves in a way that shows that. We need young women and especially young men to say, you know what, the next few years, if I'm trying to find a spouse and a mate for myself, they may be pretty, but if you find a young woman who is more concerned about the way she looks in the eyes of man than the eyes of God, it doesn't matter how pretty she is. The Lord likens her to a pig with a gold ring in its nose. You need to find somebody else. that loves God and is more concerned about what he thinks of them and the way they're dressed. 1 Timothy 2:9-10, likewise also women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, in modesty and self-control, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly attire, but what is proper for women who profess godliness, which is good works. And so Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 12 tells us that the people in Jeremiah's day could not even blush. They had fallen so far from God and his standard of morality and purity that the people could not even blush. And I think that we, even more than Jeremiah's day, are living in a time, especially when talking about clothing, we live in a day and age where people just simply do not blush. If you go to a mall, there's very little left of the imagination. People just can't blush anymore. And so we've got to make sure that we are living a life where we are concerned, just like Adam and Eve were concerned in the garden. I don't want to be naked. I don't want to be immodest before God. Well, we've got to have the same desire. We don't want to be immodest before God because it is his eyes that we're trying to please, not the eyes of man. Modesty is just as much as a heart issue and an attitude issue as it is a clothing issue. In fact, clothing, or the lack thereof, is really the outcome of someone who is not fully committed on being holy and being set apart and being pleasing to God. And so we can't just tell our young people, put on more clothes, because they get that all the time. We can't tell some of our older individuals to put on clothes. You've got to ask yourself, am I truly trying to live my life pleasing to God? Is that my number one goal? Because if it is, then you're going to be dressed modestly. And if it's not, you can say it is, but your clothing may be revealing that. That's not really your main goal in life. It's to be liked by other people based upon what you wear. And that's a problem all of us have to fight, whether we're men, women, young boys, or young girls. We've got to strive to please him in everything that we do, and that includes our clothing. And so if our life has got to be a pursuit of freedom, a pursuit of dignity, holiness, and pureness that is only found in Christ Jesus. And if we are not committed to that run, that race, don't be surprised when you find yourself before God like Adam in Genesis 3, and you find yourself immodest, both on the outside and the inside. And that's what we really got to be focused on. Are we immodest before God on the inside? Because if we are, and we probably are on the outside, but that's the main goal. 1 Peter 3:4, one last time. But let the adorning of yourselves be the hidden person of the heart, with what is imperishable beauty, of gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Can you imagine being told that you had a product that was going to make you beautiful for forever? You know, like if you're like me, first you got to get beautiful before you can stay beautiful, right? But could you imagine the amount of money? I mean, cosmetic surgeries in the U.S. have tripled since 2000. If somebody said, I've got a product that is going to give you imperishable beauty, ladies, how much money would you spend on it? We first got married and went shopping with Brittany and saw how much makeup cost. We about had a marital fight. It's like, there's no way, right? And she was like, honey, this is just what it costs. I was like, okay, go buy a bass boat. But honey, it's just what it costs, you know. But can you imagine how much money would you spend for something with imperishable beauty? Oh, you'd empty your bank accounts out, right? The Bible tells us that what real imperishable beauty is living a life that is pleasing to God. If we spent half as much time in God's Word as we did reviewing reviews on makeup or watching makeup tutorials, how much more the Bible will we know? If we put half as much money in the collection plate as we do on makeup and clothing and jewelry, how much more children could we feed? How many more churches could we establish? How many more missionaries could we support? If we were as concerned about being modest on the inside as we were about trying to beautify the outside. And so this morning, if you're not a Christian, ask yourself, have I been living my life trying to please the wrong person? Am I living my life trying to please my friends or my family or what culture, society tells me is what I should be trying to do? If you've done that, you're chasing after a beauty that's fleeting. Pursue the imperishable beauty of a life in Christ that will give you eternal salvation by confessing Him as the Son of God, by repenting of your sins and being immersed in water for the remission of those sins, and start living your life in a way that you are seeking to please Him and not man each and every day. And if you are a Christian, you've done those things, ask yourself, have I allowed culture, have I allowed society's standards to take my eyes off the real prize? And I'm not just talking about clothing right now. Maybe you're trying to please man by the way that you live your life with your house or your cars or your bank accounts or the way that you look in the community. Maybe you've taken your eyes off the real prize, the imperishable beauty and satisfaction of a life in heaven. If you need help this morning, whether it's becoming a Christian or getting your life back on track, if we can help you this morning, please come as we stand and as we sing.